Everyone, I'm Emily Capettini, and I'm going to be talking about how we can use fandom practices, mainly those with fan fiction, to create communities of care in the writing classroom. I'd like to start off with noting that fandom communities do have their own challenges with gatekeeping and inclusivity. There's been a lot of great work on racism in fandom spaces recently, and I've included some links at the end of my transcript. I wanted to mention this because it wasn't a topic that came up a lot in early fandom studies, and I don't want to reinforce the misconception that fandom spaces are automatically safe spaces for every fan, because it's just not true. So instead, what I'm going to be doing is talking about how we can take inspiration from the act or process of creating fan works and combine it with existing creative writing pedagogy to disrupt and decolonize the workshop. So I've divided my talk into 3 sections. Each section addresses one fandom practice and how it can be incorporated into the creative writing classroom, drawing on this pedagogy and including one example exercise. So there are additional resources at the end of my transcript as well that I'm not quoting or referencing here, but have informed my pedagogy and the sort of larger approaches that I've been taking and moving towards in the classroom. Okay, section 1, building a communal vocabulary. I'm going to start with a potentially controversial take. In many ways, fandom is already very similar to writing workshops. By its nature, fandom is collaborative. It operates using what Karen Helkson calls gift culture. Fans create and exchange fan works like fan art, fan fiction, or meta posts. And meta posts are essentially a close reading of a scene, a character, narrative arc, that kind of thing. These gifts, frequently inspired by existing fan works within a fandom, become part of a larger meta text, the off-putting jargon and the unspoken rules, meaning that only this group of that people can negotiate the terrain. The gift culture of fandom solidifies a community and creates jargon and unspoken rules within that community. Although there are certainly fans who have more influence within a fandom than others, all fanworks contribute collaboratively to a larger understanding of the source material, providing vocabulary specific to that material and associated fanworks. So how does one take this idea of a larger meta text and off-putting jargon and apply it to creative writing workshops with a focus on creating a community of care? I think what's valuable in this fandom practice is that at its core, it mirrors a classroom practice Felicia Rose Chavez describes in the Anti-Racist Writing Workshop. Not only should workshop participants understand the craft of writing, but they should own the terms. In my classroom, we collectively defined 4 target craft elements: voice, imagery, characterization, and arrangement, what participants insist on calling flow. All students have equal access to the language of art as defined by them. When we workshop, this shared vocabulary is on display so that we may speak about one another's work with deft precision. This meaning building transfers power back to the students and lets them collaborate towards a community-based practice. As instructors, this approach treats each creative writing class as unique, allowing us to adapt to the energy, motivations, and interests of each new group of writers. In her introduction to fandom as classroom practice, a teaching guide, Catherine Anderson Howell calls this a remix classroom, arguing that when we invite our students to engage in a remix classroom, we are asking them to look at the class and ask what they can do with it. We invite them to participate in their education, to talk back to experts and authorities, and to shape the discourse themselves. We frame teaching and learning as actions, practices to be done, not lessons to be consumed. Like Chavez, Anderson Howell argues for students to shape the discourse themselves, treating learning as a practice rather than something to accept. A remix classroom, or one that utilizes fandom practices, makes room for students' discomfort or dissatisfaction with canon or so-called standard craft practices. By asking students to approach their learning as fans do, it also challenges their perception of scholarship, both rather than consuming passively in isolation, produce in community, and discourse-centered engagement with texts. the image of the writer as an isolated genius from whom brilliant prize-winning classics spring fully formed serves no one. Such an assumption can intimidate writers before they even have a chance to grapple with what craft could possibly mean. In contrast, fandom sees no such limits, throwing itself into transformative work like art, fiction, videos, fan casting, and so on. And fan casting is when you take usually like a text, a book, and cast who would play each role. To think like a fan means that writing and craft are malleable, that there is no wrong approach, but rather an approach that may not suit you. Section 2, clarifying your own aesthetics. When it comes to fan fiction, it's standard practice to address craft-based questions when sharing a fanfic. What inspired this work? What the writer is hoping to accomplish? And or works that inspired or were inspired by this fanfic. Often, fanfic writers discuss what prompted them to write what they're sharing, either in an author's note or separate post in a personal blog like Tumblr, or is more likely for my primary audience, and including myself in this, live journal or an email listserv. On the online fan fiction repository Archive of Our Own, which is abbreviated AO3, readers can comment on fanfics by chapter, engaging in dialogue with both the work presented as well as the author's motivations. Similarly, many fans link to their Tumblrs in their work, providing another way to communicate. There are two important practices at work here. What Matthew Salas calls writers clarifying their own aesthetics, and readers meeting a writer where they're at. So entering that space and taking on that sort of good faith of, okay, this is what you're gonna do, so I'm just gonna hop in and go along with it. Letting the workshop or creative writing classroom be rebuilt anew every semester requires a lot of discussion and brainstorming in the first few weeks of class. In my class, I ask students who their favorite writers are and what they want to write, emphasizing that one does not automatically answer the other. For example, I tell them, I love high fantasy, but writing it sounds absolutely miserable. We share a narrative, book, short story, podcast, TV show, film, video game, and so on, that we recently enjoyed and why. These kinds of discussions give students a sense of their fellow writers' interests, while challenging them to think more deeply about from where they draw inspiration and what is important to them in writing. Chavez calls this mindfulness, an inversion of power. Why don't you tell me what you want to achieve, and together we can work towards that goal. Work towards your goal, excuse me. So to make this concrete, to combine these two ideas, students have a proposal assignment at the start of the semester. So the proposal states their aesthetics as they understand them at that moment, and sets goals of what they want to work on in their writing this semester. When they submit drafts to be workshopped, there is a summary of the proposal included with the workshop draft. So it acts as a kind of author's note. We refer back to the summary frequently during workshop discussion, modeled after Liz Lerman's critical response process. And the critical response process works with starting with students saying what they found interesting or striking in the text, which is what Lerman calls statements of meaning. And then the next section is the writer asks questions, and then the students ask questions of the writer. This means the writer is also an active participant in workshops, asking and answering questions. Again, this approach emphasizes Anderson Howell's point of community and discourse-centered engagement with a text. However, instead of the engagement being one-sided, which can happen if it's not a text where you have the writer in the room with you, or online and you're talking to them, this practice invites dialogue similar to the author's notes or comments on AO3. This approach can also help boost writing workshops that must be entirely online, where the energy of a group of students in one room can't be replicated. And this is my final section, and I'm including my conclusion in this part as well. Section 3, Transformative Works. Another fandom practice that can be adapted to the workshop is the process of making transformative work. On AO3, a fan creator can indicate their work is inspired by another hosted on the archive, which they can do anyway in a note, but there's a place on Archive of Our Own when you're posting something where you indicate what work it was inspired by or it inspired, and it will let you search for the work in the archive and include that link. So a link to related works is automatically included in the original work and the new work. It's at the bottom of the post and under a heading that says related works. This means a visitor can easily read through all of these works in a row or in whatever order they like, and the multivocal dialogue that they then create. Again, this is like what Chavez and Anderson Howell address in their work, a larger text created and maintained by a community of writers. In my class, I include a 10-minute free writing session following each workshop. After we finish discussing a work, students and I select something from the draft for a writing prompt. And that's an individual choice. I just tell them to look for something, and I don't ask them what yet. The writer whose work was discussed selects something from the workshop discussion as their prompt. Once the writing session is complete, we share what inspired us and how it transformed on the page. Much like the linking and interconnectedness of fan works, this free writing solidifies a community through engagement, transformation, and a shared act of imaginations. To treat another writer's work as inspiration is to recognize its inherent value. Furthermore, as Salas's adds in fiction in the real world, it's within this multiplicity of voices that participants fully comprehend the significance of their own story. A post-workshop free write can reveal how an audience reacts to or interprets a work or part of a work in ways that might not be able to be articulated in a traditional workshop discussion, or that students didn't know they were reacting that way until they started writing. Conclusion. Like many of us who teach creative writing, I have been rethinking my workshop approach, especially with the last 2 years. When the pandemic required courses be moved online, I was anxious about how to replicate that community in a digital-only space. Then I remembered how through Fandom, I had built my own communities with people that I'd never met in person, and I'd done that several times. As I began to consider what made these communities thrive, I realized that much of the fandom practices fans take as typical or expected, so those unspoken rules that you just know, could enrich pedagogical approaches focused on decolonizing the workshop. I saw a lot of fandom practices kind of echoing in the reading I was doing and in the reading I've included in this presentation. Fandom and the creation of fanworks is, at its most powerful, a pushback against traditional expectations in writing, storytelling, and craft. When we bring these actions of dialogue, play, disruption, and transformative works into the classroom, we can shift power back to our student writers and prioritize their individual goals within a larger community of collaboration and care. Thank you.